Well, hi everyone, and welcome to my home office here, where from this location I'll be bringing you how to debug iOS and Android mobile apps with Fiddler. Hopefully the title doesn't need too much explaining, as today we'll be looking at using Fiddler to inspect network traffic from your iOS and Android physical devices. Now, this is a little twist on Fiddler, because normally we're used to using Fiddler to debug locally running desktop apps or web apps. So today's scenario involves an external mobile device, of course, and hopefully by the end of our 30 to 40 minutes together here, you'll have a really good idea of how to run all this yourself. Now, if by any chance you're asking yourself, what is this Fiddler thing? Don't worry, you're not alone. At its core, Fiddler is an extremely powerful desktop tool that allows you to quickly inspect, debug, mock, and save all kinds of network requests and responses. Just think of all the remote API requests your apps make. Fiddler can capture, report on, alter, and replicate all those requests. Now, Fiddler's actually been around for more than 15 years, if you can believe it, and the UI shown here kind of gives that away. And yes, I realize that I'm showing you a Windows desktop app on a MacBook Air that's called Lazy Slide, designed by me. So if Fiddler is this network debugging proxy for any browser, any app, any process or platform, what does that mean in terms of actual use cases? Well, we can start with the obvious, debugging on devices. It also means debugging of remote API calls. Even performance testing of your APIs are possible. Analytics and monitoring can all be handled by Fiddler, along with malware analysis and security testing. Now, that's a lot for one tool to bite off, but Fiddler has some amazing capabilities baked in. And while Fiddler is best known as a desktop tool for debugging both desktop and web apps, I'm guessing many of you didn't know you can also use Fiddler to do the same on iOS and Android devices. Actually, I've got a little secret for you. You can pretty much inspect network traffic on any app or device that supports a network proxy. More on this in a bit. Now, as usual, before we really get started here, I need to run you through some logistics very quickly to make sure we all have the best experience possible during the rest of our webinar today. First off, if you can't hear me, haven't been able to hear me at any time in the last couple of minutes, or at some point in the future your audio cuts out, please try connecting with your computer audio, not your phone. This issue comes up often with GoToWebinar. If nothing else seems to help, just restart your viewer and all should be okay. But if it's not okay, if absolutely nothing works during our webinar today, or maybe you want to watch every glorious moment of this webinar again, you will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording on YouTube. We will also be sure to send some links to some of the resources we provide today. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at Telerik Fiddler. Going forward, this is going to be a key place for you to find the very latest information about Fiddler and the expanding Fiddler ecosystem. And finally, if you have any questions at all during the webinar, please don't hesitate to let us know. Just use that Q&A panel provided in your GoToWebinar viewer to ask away. We've got all sorts of Fiddler experts on the line to handle your questions, both during and immediately after the webinar. And finally, as a quick introduction, this guy you see talking in the corner is me, Rob Lauer, and I'm on the developer relations team here at Progress. You can find me on Twitter at Rob Lauer. So I do want to start with some background on Fiddler and make sure we're all kind of starting at the same level playing field. So let me start with a quick timeline of the Fiddler story. Now, Fiddler was first released back in 2003 as a free network debugging proxy on Windows only. It soon became kind of the default go-to tool for network debugging. Fast forward all the way to 2012, Telerik acquired Fiddler, and thankfully for all of us, kept it completely free to use. A couple years later, Progress acquired Telerik, and hence acquired Fiddler. And while some changes and updates were made during this time, it wasn't really until 2019 that we saw another major Fiddler release, along with a beta release of the first new Fiddler tool, called Fiddler Everywhere. Now, 2020 has already brought us very close to a new 1.0 release of Fiddler Everywhere, and even more exciting updates to the entire Fiddler ecosystem. Now, more on what exactly Fiddler Everywhere is in just a minute. So even to this day, Fiddler is wildly popular with over 100,000 downloads per month, rave reviews, a very active and growing community, and a set of industry pros who are excited about the current state and, more importantly, the future of Fiddler. However, the last thing we can do in software development is rest on our laurels, especially when our UI starts to get just a wee bit cluttered and out of date. So starting a couple years ago, we really knew the Fiddler UI was becoming a little long in the tooth, so they say. So we reached out to a lot of you and started having some conversations about, what you love about Fiddler, but even more so, what do you not like? What can we do better? And we learned a lot. We learned that the way you're using Fiddler is different from how it was maybe intended to be used, 5 or 10 years ago. The way we communicate with each other is different. The way we expect to interact with our developer tooling is different. Which platforms we use to develop on is, of course, different for some of us as well. So, how did these conversations specifically map to the future of Fiddler? Well, first we learned right away that Fiddler needs a complete overhaul of its user experience. Right? Gone are the days of the old Windows XP UIs. And no surprise, but you all aren't on Windows anymore. Many of us use macOS or Linux for app development. And finally, many of us are working in teams now, and the way we diagnose and share sensitive network logs is really much different now than maybe it was 10 or more years ago. So enter Fiddler Everywhere. Fiddler Everywhere is a completely new version of Fiddler, written using cross-platform technologies, yet sharing the same core with Fiddler. So adding new cross-platform features is far easier, and migrating existing features from the old Fiddler is really a snap, as they're all based on established functionality. Now it also has a completely revamped user experience. So Fiddler Everywhere is made available simultaneously to Windows, macOS, and Linux platforms. All features are supported equally across all those operating systems. Now, before we were ready to release this new Fiddler Everywhere to the world, we wanted to make sure we had, kind of a baseline set of features that you've all come to expect from the original Fiddler. That's why we improved upon a few key features from the old Fiddler, what I'll start to refer to as Fiddler Classic going forward. The first is the Traffic Inspector feature. Now, as many of you know, this allows you to view the details of all network traffic to and from your apps. The autoresponder lets you create and modify rules that can customize traffic to test a variety of scenarios. And the API Composer, which lets you see the results of API requests without having to use another tool. Now, but remember the last item I mentioned in our customer conversations, that being the team collaboration. So let me briefly introduce you to the team collaboration features of Fiddler Everywhere. By using the team features, you can actually save captured traffic like you've been doing for years. You can highlight certain saved sessions, add comments to them, and securely share the log files and context with your teammates. They can then open these log files in their copy of Fiddler Everywhere and continue to collaborate from there. So the way it works is very simple. I can click a button to save one or more captured sessions. I provide a name for my saved session. I optionally add some additional information or context to prepare my colleague for what I'm sharing with them. I then click to share the saved session. And I can invite my colleagues to collaborate via a simple email invite. And this allows us to securely view all the same session data within Fiddler Everywhere, and without having to share potentially sensitive data in an otherwise awkward or even potentially dangerous manner. So you might be wondering when exactly you might want to try these collaboration features. Well, this probably applies to most of us here. We're developers working on debugging an issue and want to share findings with our colleagues. Or maybe you're a support engineer working on a customer issue and want to share your analysis with the development team. Or even a QA engineer testing an app, right? You found some issues and you want to share those findings with your team. Or maybe you're just using a third-party API and want to report an issue to the owner. All of these being valid scenarios for using the new collaboration features in Fiddler Everywhere. Okay, I know I've been talking a lot about Fiddler Everywhere, so let me take this opportunity to inform you that Fiddler Classic isn't going anywhere. We are 100% committed to continuing to maintain the original version of Fiddler until we at least have feature parity with Fiddler Everywhere. So no worries there. All right, on to the meat of our webinar. As iOS and or Android developers, how do we start inspecting both secured and unsecured network traffic with Fiddler? Let's find out. Going forward today, I'm going to be using Fiddler Everywhere for my demos. Why? Well, partially because I want you to see Fiddler Everywhere, but also because I actually think it's a more pleasing experience and overall more intuitive to use, especially for new users. Now, I'm also going to run all of my demos on my Mac, another good reason to use Fiddler Everywhere. However, everything I show you here can also be done on Windows and Linux, with very, very minor alterations that I will try to make note of. In fact, what you see today can also even be accomplished with Fiddler Classic. Therefore, it's demo time. Now, instead of talking at you with my boring slides, I'd like to walk you through the full process of setting up Fiddler Everywhere to work on debugging iOS and Android physical devices. So just give me a moment as I switch over to my demo machine. All right, hopefully you can see my screen now. For those of you who are new to Fiddler or to Fiddler Everywhere, welcome. This is the new Fiddler Everywhere UI. And I want to take you on a very, very quick little journey through Fiddler Everywhere before we get started with our iOS and Android debugging. In the main column here, you'll see we have our live traffic capture. Now this is capturing every HTTP and HTTPS request to from my machine. You'll notice when you start Fiddler Everywhere, you are prompted to install what's known as a man-in-the-middle certificate. This is going to help Fiddler Everywhere capture these secure HTTPS requests as well, which is the majority of traffic going on these days anyway. So if I click on an individual request, in this example there's something going on with iCloud from my machine, you'll see I can inspect the request, so I can see the details of the request, if there's any text associated with it, any web forms that were involved, any cookies for instance. In the response as well can be fully inspected, so I can see the response headers, if there were any text involved. More commonly, I might want to look at any JSON response that was coming from a third-party API. So very simple, very powerful piece of functionality here. What I actually like about Fiddler Everywhere, probably my favorite feature, is this autoresponder. So what you can do with autoresponder is you can actually set it up to automatically respond to any incoming request or outgoing request. So I could say, in this instance, I want to match this URL exactly. So this is our catfact API that we're going to be using today. And the action I want to return is a delay of 3,000 milliseconds. This is one of, almost a limitless number of actions we can perform on a request. In this case, we would be mocking up a situation where there's a 3-second delay that comes from this API. So I can start testing out what happens in my app if there's a delay in the API. I can test out what happens if the request is dropped entirely, if there's an exit returned. Or like I said, if the request is dropped, what happens with my app? Does my app break? So we can go through just tons of different types of actions that happen when a request is made. There is also an API composer here, and this is going to be familiar to those of you who are using Postman, for instance. What I can do is I can compose APIs within Fiddler Everywhere. I can add headers and parameters, and I can inspect the result that comes back from those API calls. And the last thing really quickly, I know I talked about this earlier, but that is the ability to save batches of sessions. So I can select one or more sessions. I can save them. I can also choose to share those sessions. So I choose a shared set here, and I can, like I showed in those team collaboration slides, I can actually start entering in email addresses here and start collaborating on these shared session with fellow Fiddler Everywhere users. So that is my 2-minute quick run through of Fiddler Everywhere. Obviously there's a lot more to it, but let's get on to our actual demo. So what I want to do is start with iOS. Now my first disclaimer for you is that this is only going to work on your local network. So if you're at home, on your home Wi-Fi network or whatever, at work, it's only going to work in your local network. So you can't actually connect to a device over the internet. So your mileage may vary a little bit here and there, but this should work for the vast majority of us. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the IP address for my iOS device. So let me bring up that device. Here it is. And I'm going to open up my settings, and I do that by going to the network I'm connected to. And you'll see my local IP address there. It is 192.168.0.118. Now I'm going to make note of that for later. My next step is to get the local IP address of this computer I'm on. I happen to be on a Mac. This is where it's a little bit different for Macs and PCs. With a Mac, I'm just going to go into my network settings, and I'm going to go to my, it's right here on my Wi-Fi settings here. And so again, I'm going to write down 192.168.0.111. Now I know the two IP addresses, because this is going to be important so I can make sure these two are connected to each other. And by the way, in Windows, you can do the same thing. You can open up a PowerShell prompt and do ipconfig to get your IP address. I'm sure it's in the control panel somewhere as well. It's pretty easy to get your local IP. You don't want to get your public IP, your local IP, just to be clear about that. All right, now my next step is going to be to actually ping my device from my laptop here. So I'm just going to issue a simple ping from my terminal, and I'm going to ping 192.168.0.118. And this is great. So I'm getting a result back from my iOS device. Now I didn't have to change any firewall settings, luckily enough. It just worked for me out of the box. All right, now that we've passed that step, we are going to next want to set up Fiddler Everywhere to receive incoming connections. So I'm going to head back to Fiddler Everywhere. I'm going to go to my settings and look at my connections tab over here. Two things of note. Fiddler is going to listen to external connections on port 8866. We're going to want to remember that for later. We also want to make sure that this setting is enabled, and that is allow remote computers to connect. Very important. Make sure that's checked. It is not checked by default. So now that I've verified that's correct, I know Fiddler Everywhere is set up properly. Now I want to set up Fiddler as a proxy on my iOS device. All right, now this is where it starts getting slightly trickier. But let me go back, and I'm going to head back to my settings, and I'm going to go to, actually I'm going to go back to my Wi-Fi settings, and I am going to scroll down to the configure proxy option at the bottom. And I'm going to configure a manual proxy, and the server is going to be the IP address of my laptop, which I wrote down as 192.168.0.111. And the port is the port that Fiddler Everywhere is listening on, which is 8866. And there's no authentication required, so I can leave that blank. Now I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go back to Fiddler Everywhere just to see what's going on here. Now, I've actually have live traffic paused here. And this is a good thing, because this is one thing. If you are interested in using iOS and Android with Fiddler, a feature request we have is to be able to kind of discern the difference in traffic from what's going on my local machine to what's going on my connected device. Right now, that ability does not exist. So what I have to do is to pause traffic being collected locally. I'm going to remove it all, and now any traffic that comes in, I'll know it's coming in from my device. So let's start grabbing some traffic. So I'm going to do that by, I'm just going to open an app here, Untapped. It's one of my favorite apps. And you'll see my connections are coming in here, and it looks good. I mean, there's a lot of connections going on here. You see I'm experiencing an error in the app. This is kind of interesting. Well, if we look here in the protocol, you'll see that only HTTP requests are being logged. Why would that be? Well, the problem is I have not installed any kind of certificate on my device to allow Fiddler to capture that data. So as a one-time step, what you need to do is actually install a certificate on your device. So I'm going to head back, and I'm going to open up Safari, and I'm going to type in a special URL, and that is IPv4. And it's actually right here, IPv4.fiddler:8866. Now, when I head here, you'll see this all important section. We're going to download the Fiddler root certificate. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to prompt me with all these kind of scary warnings. We're going to download the profile, and we're going to install it on this device, so on my iPhone. Okay, so the profile's been downloaded. It doesn't mean that the certificate's been installed. And to do that, I need to head back to my settings. Alright, back in my settings, you're going to see this new option that's labeled Profile Downloaded. Tap on that, and then we get another scary prompt that says, do not trust Fiddler root. Well, actually you can trust it because this is the profile we just installed, or just downloaded. So I'm going to go ahead and run my passcode here. Sorry, I got to take the screen off, make it invisible for a second as I type in my passcode. And I'm going to bring it back here. Alright, we're going to get another warning. Installing the certificate, it will add it to your list of trusted certificates. Trust me, we want to install this. We install it, it's good. We're good to go. Now my configuration profile is all set, and I'll show you how to remove this later on as well. So back in Fiddler Everywhere, I'm going to remove all this traffic again, and I'm going to go back, I'm going to reset Untapped, and let's bring it back up. Now let's see what we're getting. Oh, we're getting another error. What's going on? The problem is that I've not actually enabled the certificate yet. Yay, more configurations. So I'm going to head back to General, About, and scroll all the way down to Certificate Trust Settings. You like how these features are all nicely hidden. And now we need to enable full trust for root certificates. I'm going to enable that. Alright, now, for real this time, let's head back to Fiddler Everywhere and bring up my screen, open Untapped. Now we're getting the data we expected to see. So we can see here that we're seeing HTTP and HTTPS requests coming through perfectly. So this is what I wanted to show you. These are the steps involved for getting iOS set up with Fiddler. So again, going back to Fiddler Everywhere, I can grab an individual request. I can start inspecting this. I could even right-click here and I could add this as a rule. And we could take a look here, and for this exact request, we can return a manually crafted response. Pretty cool stuff here that we can do with Fiddler as we want to get in and try to start inspecting these requests. Okay, so that is iOS in a nutshell, right? With the steps we went through, just to recap them again, we had to download the profile from our local machine. We had to install it in our settings, in our app settings here. In fact, let me show you that. Well, let me start with the network settings. So we started with configuring the proxy. We then installed that profile, which showed up here underneath my Apple TV free year available. And then we had to go into General, About, and Certificate Trust Settings to enable this. Now, if I want to back out of all this, because obviously at some point we're going to want to use our phone, like we normally want to use it, I can head back to my Wi-Fi and I can configure my proxy and just turn it off. Pretty cool to access Fiddler features from my iOS device. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and look and see how I do pretty much the exact same thing with Android. Unfortunately, with Android, there's a couple other weird little steps involved, and we're going to take a look at those in detail here. So let me bring my Android device up. Alright, here's my Android device. Now, the steps we need to go through to set up are pretty similar to start with. The first thing I need is my IP address. So I'm going to head into my settings here and dive into my Wi-Fi settings again. And I can see that my local IP address is right there. It's 192.168.0.214. Let's go back and let's ping that just to double check. And good news, we're getting a successful ping. That's all good. And I've already enabled remote connections in Fiddler, so that's all good. So now I need to set up that proxy again. And the way I do that is to go back here, and I'm going to do a long press on my network connection, and I'm going to say modify network. And you'll notice there's a little advanced options here. And there's our proxy. So I can set up a manual proxy. They don't make it super easy, do they? And once again, I am going to put in the IP address of my Mac. Again, I could be doing this on Windows or Linux as well with Fiddler Everywhere. Pretty cool. And actually, that's not the right one. It's 111. And remember, the proxy port is 8866. So I'm going to save that. And I do need to install that certificate as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head to my browser. And I'm going to go to my Fiddler Echo service, which is that IPv4.fiddler:8866. And I'm going to download that Fiddler root certificate. It's prompting me to download it again because, of course, I've already gone through this process. And I need to put my... Sorry, I'm not going to let you see my device pattern here. My security pattern. Alright. So I can name the certificate, so let's just call it Fiddler... If I could spell tiny keyboard, Fiddler Webinar. How about that? Alright, so it says at the bottom, Fiddler Webinar is installed. So now the good news is, from here, I can actually start inspecting HTTP and HTTPS traffic, just like that. So if I head to, let's say, how about a website like npr.org. We'll start seeing HTTP and HTTP requests coming in. All good, right? Okay, here's where it gets trickier with Android. I cannot, at this point, start looking at traffic coming from other apps. So, I can only inspect secure traffic from apps that I'm actively developing. But, there's still a bit of a trick here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go ahead and install a new app on this device that I'm developing. I happen to be using NativeScript, which I'm sure there's some NativeScript folks on the line here, which is great. And I'm going to run, so I've got this Fiddler demo app, TNS run Android, which is going to build and deploy an app to my device here. And as this is running, I'm just going to show you the code here quickly. Let's bring you off screen for a bit. So this app is incredibly simple. Those of you who have used NativeScript will recognize the app when I show it to you. In fact, let me bring that up here. If I could click and drag you over without resizing you, that'd be wonderful. Here we go. It's simply going to tap a button and send a message back. And the message is going to come, it's going to be a cat fact. Actually, sorry, the message is going to be these little cat emojis when we have a successful return of a request. So I'm just hitting this endpoint, and it's gonna, if it's a successful request, it's gonna return my little emojis. Otherwise, it's gonna show an error. And I need to reiterate here: you, of course, do not need to be using NativeScript for this to work. You can be developing with Java or Kotlin, Ionic, any kind of capacitor, Cordova, any sort of way you develop apps on Android. So, as a stock app, any kind of Android app, let's see what happens if I tap my button here. It gives a network request failed. That's again because even though I've installed that certificate locally, the fact that I am targeting an API that is greater than 24, I think that's when Android started enforcing this security requirement. So what we're going to do is make some relatively minor changes to our app that are temporary just for when I'm testing. The first is to add what's called a network security config file. And this is going to exist in my just in my Android resources directory. So it can be it can actually be wherever you want, but I happen to put it in this XML directory in my Android resources. And it's a basic XML file. You can find the syntax for this online anywhere you need. The key here is this addition of that we're going to trust any user added certificates, right? So my certificate source equals user. Okay, that's step one. I've got this file in here. I also have some change to my Android manifest, and that is to point my network security config to that file. All right, should be good. Now my app should reload here, and oh boy, trouble moving this around. Here we go. And let's double check to make sure. Oh, it's actually rebuilding the app now because I made a change to a resource that requires the app to be rebuilt from scratch. So we'll wait for this to pop back up. And while we're waiting for that to build, let's take a look again quickly here just to see where exactly this goes. So this is going to go in your application tag in your Android manifest file. And the exact syntax is this Android : network security config, and then the path to that network security config XML file. All pretty straightforward. All right, my app is back up here. And let's move over to Fiddler Everywhere. Let's remove all my traffic here. Okay, so now I'm going to tap the button and yay! So we get to see that we created a request to our CatFac API, which runs over HTTPS. My app visually told me it was successful, which is great. So let's hide you again and just take a quick look at this API. So when I send this request in, it's going to return some JSON, I'm guessing. And sure enough, we can see that returns an array of values here. For example, the oldest cat video on YouTube dates back to 1894. So a pretty cool way of looking at inspecting the requests for my APIs created from for my APIs requested from the app I created. So again, pretty quick overview here, but I think you saw how quickly we were able to configure iOS and Android to start using Fiddler Everywhere as a means of grabbing all those requests and responses and inspecting that traffic with my mobile apps. Another clarifying point here is I haven't talked about Fiddler Classic much here, but you can do the same thing with Fiddler Classic. The instructions are almost identical. I believe the port number is a little bit different. I think it's 8888 instead of 8866. But otherwise, everything you saw here today can absolutely be done with Fiddler Classic as well. All right, so let me head back to my slides and just finish up here. All right, back here. I hope that all made sense and that you're able to use Fiddler Everywhere to inspect and debug those mobile apps. But before we end today, I do have the proverbial one more thing to talk about. And that has a little bit to do with the unfortunate reality that remotely debugging issues you receive from customers is not easy. So maybe that person is working from home like many of us now, or just on an unfamiliar network, or in their office behind a corporate firewall. There are a myriad network scenarios that directly lead to problems that we need to effectively diagnose. And to really diagnose these issues, frankly, it's not easy for customers as they have no easy way to submit their network log files, especially for non-technical users. And they're worried about privacy and security of their data. And support teams, they waste a ton of time with that back and forth between them and the customers. Just collecting log files is like pulling teeth, right? And there's loads of internal compliance and security issues they also need to work around. Finally, developers, we don't have much to go on due to a lack of information and inability to replicate issues with the scarce amount of info that we have on hand. Well, I'm excited to say that in the coming weeks, you'll have a chance to experience our way of solving this problem, and that is with a brand new product called Fiddler Jam. And at the risk of reading text off a slide, I can tell you now that Fiddler Jam is a troubleshooting solution for support and dev teams to really help them troubleshoot issues in a fast, easy, and secure manner. What does this all mean? Well, in practice, it means that non-technical customers will be able to use a browser extension or a lightweight desktop app, similar to Fiddler Cap, to report issues securely via the cloud. And then support engineers can triage these requests via a customized web portal. Finally, developers can securely transfer these logs to Fiddler Everywhere and use the Fiddler tooling to quickly and easily replicate and diagnose the issues at hand. Pretty cool stuff. Now you can learn a little more about Fiddler Jam and sign up for early access at telerik.com/fiddler-jam. I highly recommend you take a look. And with that, I thank you all very, very much for attending. In terms of next steps for you, first of all, go and download Fiddler Everywhere for free today at telerik.com/fiddler-everywhere. Also, take a look at what's coming with Fiddler Jam and sign up for early access at telerik.com/fiddler-jam. All right, that's all from me. Have a fantastic rest of your day.